you know, obviously, as I said, Paul spent a lot of his time talking about the revelation and truth for Christianity. I think that's so important to see that witnessed, and then me talk about not a similar topic. I'm not going to talk about Islam's concept of the Creator and of faith. I think there's just so much I would agree with. But that's not what genuine interfaith dialogue is. And I think, and I was envious, so I threw some slides on to Paul. No. And I agree with him that sometimes photos, I don't have that much material on the slides other than just some pictures to toggle our conversation. But I do think interfaith dialogue is important. And I know the rabbi mentioned interreligious versus interfaith. Whatever you want to call it, I think the absence of dialogue is harmful. That creates balkanizations in society. Dialogue done with the premise of a false uniformity is extraordinarily harmful because it creates false premises, and thus the construct and the contracts of society are those built on false information rather than on truth, as Paul mentioned. And to me, there's nothing I respect more than whether it's an employee or a common citizen or a neighbor who has the honesty and integrity to tell me what they believe truthfully rather than to lie to my face or to say that I'm a good boss or whatever, when in fact I'm doing things that need correction and need direction. And I think that's the reality of human nature. And that's why I think if you wanted to know everything you want to know about interfaith dialogue, we teach to our kindergartners, right? It's about honesty, forthrightness, and truth. And I think this is, if you're going to hear anything, I think, from a Muslim today, and how does interfaith dialogue work, it is a bit sterile and wrong to look at Islam in a vacuum of what it may exist in Omaha today from a Muslim that happens to be a doctor or a lawyer practicing in the sanctuary of Omaha, Nebraska, where there's no bullets, no violence that's threatening him from radical religious groups. Islam is not being tested. Their Muslimness is not being tested. Their treatment of Christians is not being tested because they're not running government, etc. That is sterile. Their understanding of Islam might be something that they may present to you, but you can't take their narrative without putting it in the context of what is Islam globally. But there is not only one Islam. There are many versions of Islam. So the question is, whose Islam? Is it the Islam of children praying, that I pray with my family, with my 3 children and my wife, at the mosque when we talk about things that are spiritual versus things that are political? Or is it the Islam of bin Laden, of Boko Haram, of Jamaat Islamiyya in Pakistan, of the Saudi Arabian government? When our president, and this is not a partisan statement, but when our president has the chutzpah to tell me what is and what is not Islamic, that is a problem. We had our president at the speech that he gave at the UN saying that ISIS is not Islamic. It is neither a state nor is it Islamic. You know, it's very easy for the leader of the free world to stand up at a podium and tell the world that ISIS is not Islamic. Now, would he say that of the Islamic State, Islamic Republic of Iran, or the Islamic Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, or the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, where these governments, Saudi Arabia beheaded 30 people in the last 2 months in their governments. ISIS did not come out of thin air. The only reason he was as clear about ISIS was they don't sit behind, they don't have their Baghdadi caliphate leader is not sitting behind a name tag at the UN, so he's not really worried about their lobby right now globally. But this is the problem, is he's really not speaking a truth. And when you cover what Islam can be by saying it's not Islamic, you actually then give Muslims in Omaha, in Phoenix, in Washington, and in Europe, where we are sitting in freedom, you give us a pass. Because we don't have the drive and the fuel to say, well, wait a minute. You know, if you're in Omaha and you believe in Islam, what makes you different than ISIS? Just because you're not enacting these things violently? Or how do you reject these things? And even when they reject the acts of violence and the dogma that is pushed by ISIS and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and others, you need to read between the lines about what they're actually saying. Because I would tell you that while the vast majority of you here are most likely non-Muslim and Christians, the issue is America is not at risk of being taken over by radical Islam. We're barely 1% of the population here. But the issue is as America has seen as being the shining city on the hill, as Abraham Lincoln described the West and described America, Muslims in America could be integral in leading the change to create a world that isn't where 70% of the planet right now lives in prisons. 70% of the world lives in a religious prison where they cannot practice their faith freely and openly. Out of 5 to 6 billion people, that's quite a few people. Most of those countries, save China and Russia, are Muslim-majority countries where they can't practice. Minorities, Muslims for the most part, can't practice their faith freely because of Islamic regimes. So when we label them as Islam, we forget that the number one largest faith group that's killed by radical Muslims are Muslims. And then Christians and Jews, who really don't exist as much anymore in the Muslim world because they've been pushed out because of the severe anti-Semitism that exists. And I remember a joke my grandfather used to say. My family left Syria. They were political refugees from Syria. And they came to America because I grew up in Wisconsin and learned that I could practice my faith more freely in Wisconsin than I could in Syria or Egypt or any other Muslim-majority country. And that told us something. We came to the U.S., I was taught that the integral nature of freedom, of our faith, is being able to live in a laboratory where you can accept or reject your faith. That God would not, Judgment Day and the judgment of whether we've accepted whatever faith that is, would not be real if he didn't know that we had free will to accept or reject these things. So therefore, government can't be in the business of establishing religion. And that's why if you ask who are my heroes are our founding fathers, especially Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, who were really the key Christian leaders that were lay people who understood their faith but rejected theocracy, rejected the control of the church in government and the establishment of the church and the establishment of government through the church itself. And I think it's very educational. We have a Muslim youth project called Muslim Liberty Project in which we tell our youth that they should look and learn from American history because it's not an accident that the word Christian is not in the Declaration of Independence or in the founding documents. It doesn't make it not a Christian country. This is certainly a Christian country. I would not want to live in a country that was godless. But it's a country under God, and that's why as I listen to Pastor Paul, the bottom line is that the values we get come from God, from our Creator. And how we understand those is our social contract. Our personal contract is about whether it be through Jesus or through God. However we translate those in our particular faiths, the bottom line is the government is there to give us the space so that A, we don't kill one another, and B, we live together as a unit to protect our security. So I would tell you, and when I served in the Navy, we used to have, some would call it Bible study, Quran study, scriptural studies. Once a week there was a Mormon, the Jewish head of deck who was on my ship, a Catholic, a Baptist, and myself would get together once a week and go through scripture on our ship, and afterwards we'd smoke a cigar. And it was just, it had a huge impact on me because we were 6 months, we went out to Somalia in Operation Restore Hope off of Mogadishu, and you remember that back in '93. And I can tell you that when it came to protecting our country, we would have died for one another. When it came to what we thought about heaven and who was going to heaven, we might have had some disagreement. Now, my personal theology is I believe in our form of Islam that Jews and Christians will go to heaven, that ultimately they believe in the same God, that we are able to intermarry. Now, does that square with what some of the radicals say about Islam? It doesn't. But ultimately, this is the debate happening within the House of Islam. And if you look to have interfaith dialogue, you're going to want to have interfaith dialogue with those who accept your social contract, whether they're a majority or a minority. And this is why it's not about the personal beliefs, about the individual belief about them and God. Interfaith dialogue is only possible with two things. One is if they believe that if they were a majority, they would believe in the same rules for society as you would. If they believe that if they became a majority, they would change the rules to be Islamic law, canonic law, as we saw before the American Revolution, or any other type, then their religious belief is not just about theology. It's about supremacism, control, government, lack of liberty. So I would tell you that the first premise for interfaith dialogue is a mutual, unified understanding of liberty. In America, we call that Americanism. So I can tell you anecdotes of stories in which I went to the meeting of the Islamic Society of North America in 1995 in uniform. I talk about this in my book. I went with the head of endocrinology at Bethesda, who had taken care of Bush 41 when he had thyroid disease. And we went to present a paper at the Islamic Medical Society, which is non-political, theological organization, just Muslims that gathered to talk about medicine. And then at the end of that meeting happened with the Islamic Society of North America, now the largest Muslim, was also at that time the largest Muslim organization in the country. It has deed and trust to 30-40% of the mosques through the NIT, North American Islamic Trust. And for the most part, they stay away from politics, and if you look at their website, it looks like what most of us would not disagree with. And yet, if you look at their origins, the FBI will tell you through the Holy Land Foundation and other documents that they are sprouted from the Muslim Brotherhood movement in the Middle East through meetings that were documented in 1991 and onward. Now, what is the Muslim Brotherhood? The Muslim Brotherhood on Sunday, depending on which day of the week you're talking about, will condemn violence, and other days they will promote and condone Hamas, which is a terrorist organization. So the Muslim Brotherhood is a political party that uses Islam to achieve a political control of a society. And they're very different than the Christian Democrats in Germany, but still, the unique thing in America is we don't have religious political parties. We certainly have people empowered by their religion and their political activism, but we don't have religious parties like we see in the Middle East, or even some that are still left in Europe. But I would tell you that this is very relevant to understanding Muslim groups in America. When I was there, we went, the Islamic Society of North America, the head imam who was giving the keynote address, Siraj Wahaj, who is still a well-known imam for the Council on American Islamic Relations and ISNA, takes the Quran, holds it up. He's giving a speech about being against abortion and a lot of other values that I might agree with, family values issues, etc., and was condemning Clinton for some of those beliefs, which I probably also agreed with some of what he said on those things. But then he goes on to say that the way to get these values in America is they're missing Islam. They're missing the values that our Quran brings. And why? Because this country was doomed because it has a man-made document as its constitution and not the Quran as its constitution, which we as Muslims believe is God's scripture and God's word. So he holds up the Quran and says the only countries that will be saved and successful are those that the Quran is the constitution. And I tell you that anecdote because as I listened to that, as a naval officer, as an American citizen, I got lightheaded. I was truly pre-syncopal, going to pass out. I sat down. He finished his speech. They then gave an open mic for people to talk about their bazaars, their booths they may have at this meeting. I then went to the mic and didn't have anything to announce except to tell the group publicly. There were about 10,000 Muslims there. Now that convention happens annually. There's 40,000 to 50,000 Muslims that gather at those meetings. And I told them, you guys are free to disagree with foreign policy, empower yourselves in whatever collectivist fashion you want to, but the public declaration of the wholesale change of the Constitution is sedition, by any way you describe it. And I said, not only am I disavowing any relationship with this organization, I would ask anyone who values their citizenship oath to leave this organization and to work with me to counter the ideas in this organization. Now, I was a naval officer, and I couldn't do that, obviously. We can't get involved in organizations, but I was very much continuing to work on this behind the scenes. Fast forward 4 years later, I met my wife-to-be, who I was blessed to meet in 1998, and we got married soon thereafter. And I met her parents, and they looked at me like they had met me before, and I had never met them. And they said, "Wait a minute, you were at that meeting?" And I said, "Yeah," and the silence was deafening. And this is the sad part, is that our community, most people there agreed with me. They were not happy with what the imam said. But there's still not acting on it. And that was in 98. I'm not a post-9/11 anti-Islamist, anti-Muslim Brotherhood activist. I've been doing this since I was in college, and I talk in my book about what it is in college that brought me to understand the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamist movements. And I come to you with this because interfaith dialogue is the head of the spear of fixing a lot of these issues. Because the way you do it, if it's not done in an American construct, where you challenge their beliefs on the social contract of their constitutionality, of their belief in this system. If they tell you, I did a panel in Des Moines a couple years ago where the head of the mosque, the oldest mosque in America, stood up and said, well, Jasser doesn't have the qualifications to say any of this. He doesn't know what he's talking about. We are not a fifth column, and I never said they were. We are not a fifth column, and we believe in the American Constitution. But if we're a majority, as they may exist in Egypt and elsewhere, democracy means you can vote in changes to the Constitution. Democracy is elections. And I said, then after he was done, I said, thank you very much. You just proved to this community that you are a fifth column, that you are an insurgency, that basically you would change the laws of the land based upon the electoral process. And that's why the word democracy is not in our founding documents, as those of you who understand and have read about liberty. There's a reason, because democracy is the oppression of the majority. And that's what Egypt turned into. The Arab awakening, as we see the Muslim community, Arabs, which are 90% Muslim, decided, as most of our families long knew would happen, that they were finally going to wake up to reject autocracy and reject dictatorship. And that rejection was, I believe, a huge step forward. Because aside from the core, and I'll tell you, Islamic reform and modernization has some central nuclear issues that I'm going to get into, but the cell feeding that nucleus of Islamism, of political Islam, is two sides of the same coin. One side is Arab dictatorship, fascism, Arab nationalism. No different than Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy, you know, the Arab nationalism of Nasser, Mubarak, Sadat, and then in Syria, the Assad family, in Iraq, Saddam Hussein. These are not religious individuals. These are secular Arab nationalists who are socialists. But they embraced religion in order to give the masses the opium that they wanted. Saddam Hussein, when he was on the ropes initially in the mid-90s after the Persian Gulf war, added La ilaha illallah to the Iraqi flag in order to tell the community that he was a religious person, because the Islamists were growing in their influence. The bottom line is that in the Middle East, we've been duped, and if there's one of the few things I want you to take away from my talk this morning is that there are not only two choices in the Middle East. Our foreign policy, and there's a chapter in my book called Changing the Paradigm, our foreign policy in the Middle East has been screwed up because of, when Reagan was president, I was completely on board of the fact that the biggest threat to the world was the Soviet Union. But as a result, we had a policy in which the enemy of our enemies became our friend, and we still have that policy in a number of areas. But the enemy of our enemy is not our friend. There are people that we went to bed with, including Saddam Hussein, who share none of our principles of freedom, of liberty, of morality, of honesty. And for a while we said, well, that's their problem, it's not ours. And that's just not true. President Bush, 43, was right when he said, every individual left to their own devices wants to be free. And if there's one way to summarize what we're trying to do at the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, we're not missionaries. We don't believe in evangelizing Islam. What we want to do is create laboratories like America around the world where we can have a free market of ideas. And that's what interfaith dialogue is, where you can have a free market of ideas. It's like in my medical practice. I think it's immoral and unethical for me to go around talking bad about other doctors. If people are going to come to me as a patient, I want them to come to me because they want me to be their doctor and they want me to take care of them. Faith is no different. Family is no different. You want to have free market of ideas to share principles so that you can come together or separate whenever you want. You don't have to worship the same way or together. It's good to do some prayers and collectivism that we do, like opening Congress and other things. But for the most part, we can't do those things together because we then lose our identity. And when I was growing up, I learned I wanted to grow up in a small town in Wisconsin where the Christian community celebrated Christmas and believed in it, because once they did that, they would then feel that they needed to give me the right to celebrate Ramadan and Eid al-Adha and our major holidays. Because European secularism, the laïcité policies of France, and other hyper-secularism that's anti-religious is actually fuel for radical Islam. And that's why Europe has a much bigger problem with ghettoization of Muslims, etc. Because when you push things underground, it actually causes them to thrive. And that's why, as much as it was difficult to see the Muslim Brotherhood take over Egypt, I can tell you that 1 year of the Muslim Brotherhood running Egypt did more to destroy the ideas of political Islam than 65 years of dictatorship after the British and French pulled out of the region. Nasser, Sadat, Mubarak did more to allow the Brotherhood to become victims and say that they are the answer to, because these dictators paint secularism as being the problem. These dictators show that if you don't have a religious government, then it must be, if you don't have Islamic governance, then somehow secularism is bad, it's evil. And that's how Hamas won elections against Fatah. They painted the non-Islamic governments of Fatah as being evil because Fatah, it was evil. It was a Palestinian fascist group that taught hate of the Jews and hate of Israel. So both sides of that coin are basically the same coin, and there has to be a third pathway. And that third pathway in the Middle East is ultimately what I would call a liberty narrative. And I think the struggle for interfaith dialogue is about liberty versus Islamism right now. The dictators are on their way out. The monarchs, they're circling the wagons, but the bottom line is because of YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, their days are numbered. It may take a while. In Syria, we see a destruction, a genocide of a civilization because the West could not get behind anybody there. And we can argue that and talk about that tonight in the questions and answers if you want. But all I can tell you is a foreign policy where the West is not involved, which is really what's happening now, isolationism, is doomed to failure. That's called Darwin's theory. And in Darwin's theory of evolution, when the good moral people of the world sit aside, you have Russia, Iran, and China driving what the leadership is in the Middle East. You have the Qataris and the Saudis fueling with petrodollars radical Islam. And right now, when I went to Bahrain, and these comments are my own, not the Commission's comments, but and on the U.S. Commission of International Religious Freedom, when we go visit and try to advance religious liberty, it's amazing how much of a shift. The monarchs were sitting with me and saying, Zuhdi, we agree with you. Political Islam is such a big problem. And it's true, the UAE, one of the emirates of the monarchs, last month declared the Council on American Islamic Relations a terrorist organization. So, before you applaud, listen, I don't disagree with you that they're not a good organization. If you Google my name and care, you will find thousands of hits of them attacking me as being not a Muslim, being against the Muslim community, etc., etc. But declaring them a terrorist organization is the way to make them grow. Because what happens is it pushes them underground and it prevents us from monitoring them. Even despite World War II and despite the Cold War, we never outlawed the Communist Party. We never outlawed the Nazi Party. We monitor them. We expose them as being marginal and hate groups, etc. But Brandenburg versus Ohio was a Supreme Court case that determined that as long as they don't openly, directly advocate violence, we tolerate their hate speech so that we can monitor them. Otherwise, it goes underground, and Europe will tell you, Europe has a ton of hate speech laws, and I will tell you it is a failure. They've outlawed Holocaust denial. They've outlawed a number of things which we might all viscerally agree with, but intellectually, it actually they have a much bigger problem with hate groups as a result. So we could argue these things, but I can tell you now, El-Sisi in Egypt, what he's doing to the Brotherhood is giving them jet fuel. And it's not the right way. There has to be a third way, which I would tell you is through reform. There's a French scholar, philosopher, who 3 weeks ago wrote a piece in which he said, the root of this evil that today steals your faith is within the monster that's emerged from your own belly. And he's a Muslim. devout Muslim. He said, "Oh, my dear Muslim world, I hear the cry of rebellion rising in you, and it. Yes, you are right. Like every one of the great sacred inspirations of the world's religions, Islam has, throughout its history, created beauty, justice, meaning, and good. And it has been a source of powerful enlightenment for humans who are on the path through the mystery of existence. Here in the West, I fight," and he wrote this from Paris a few weeks ago. "Here in the West, I fight in all my books so that this wisdom of Islam and of all religions is not forgotten or despised. But because of my distance from the Muslim world, I can see that which you cannot. And this inspires me to ask you, why has this monster stolen your face? Why has this despicable monster chosen your face and not another? The truth is that behind this monster hides a huge, huge problem, one you do not seem ready to confront. Yet in the end, you will have to find the courage to do so. The root of this evil that today steals your face is within yourself. The monster emerged from your own belly, which you created. And other monsters, some even worse, will emerge as long as you refuse to acknowledge your sickness and to finally tackle the root of that evil." And you know, this Muslim writer, his name is Marian Bidar. He's a philosopher and has written a number of books about self and individuality. And I can tell you, Islam as a faith is decentralized. We don't have a church, contrary to the Saudis and the other theocrats of Iran and others that think they can tell us who's Muslim and who's not. Imam means teacher, just like rabbi means teacher. It doesn't mean faith leader or intermediary between an individual and God. To me, as a Muslim, that's a good thing. But for a community and a world that's looking for reform and direction, it's bad because you don't have a unified leadership. And currently, the leadership of our faith, the theological component, are the Islamists. And the Islamists are those who believe in the Islamic State. And if I could tell you if you're going to look at which Muslims to work with in an interfaith mechanism, there are some key components of reform. Number one, and this is the mission statement of our organization, do they believe in the Islamic State? Not just ISIS, which finally, we've had some validation that when we formed our mission statement in 2003, we said, AIFD is not dedicated against terrorism is a symptom. We're dedicated to the separation of mosque and state, that's the best way to support the U.S. Constitution and liberty. Because that is what the Establishment Clause is all about, and that's what is the only antidote to political Islam or Islamism. So when you look for partners, do they give you an apologetic about the Islamic State? Oh, well, no, none of these 56 countries of the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, none of these countries get it. If they had the Islamic State right, then it would be fine. But they're all autocrats, and do they give you that apologetic? If they do, you shouldn't work with them. Because as the West proved, and listen, people say, well, is Islam inherently theocratic? Is it inherently theocratic? I'm not going to make you all experts on Islamic theology before you leave here in 5 minutes, but I would ask you, Christianity itself. Yes, the Bible says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar and unto God's what is God's. But it took Christians and it took Christendom 1,789 years until you actually had a government with a document that recognized that. 300 years of initial Christianity, laity weren't even allowed to read their own scripture in Latin. So this is the issue, is it a problem with the faith itself, or is it a problem of the interpretation of its followers? And I think that the problem is both sides. If you say it's the faith itself, you're basically dooming humanity into a clash of civilization where 1.5 billion people are going to either be converted or fought against in a war. Or you say, let's work within the house of Islam with those who are taking sides in the liberty narrative against the Islamists, whether it be Khomeinists in Iran, the Islamic Party of Pakistan, Boko Haram in Somalia, all of these Islamist movements that are about 20 to 30, sometimes 40% of the population. Those are the Muslims you want to work with, those that believe that they not only condemn violence, which is a symptom, but condemn the ideology of political Islam. Or are they giving you apologetics? That, well, political Islam can be done right. The Islamic State, if Christians if they just would pay a jizya, a tax, and we would give them their rights from Islam, then it would be all okay. It's not violence. Well, that's an inequality that's un-American. And I think this is what interfaith dialogue should challenge. Now the question is, how do you do that? If you challenge it by saying that, well, the prophet's wife was 9 years old and he was a pedophile and he was a general that beheaded individuals, if you use all of these types of narratives, which are Orientalist in their origin, which we could argue as being mythology or not, I would reject as a Muslim and tell you that they're false narratives. I don't believe them to be the truth. You know, you can't reform a faith in which you demonize the individual that is, we believe to be the messenger of the Word of God. That's just not a method of... Now, if you want to challenge those things and say, you know, well, can you explain this to me? And if they tell you, well, marrying a 9-year-old is okay, and they don't tell you that, you know, the narrative I was given was that that wasn't consummated till much, much later, and that there was reasons to prevent war, etc., that happened. And the other part of passages, you know, in the end of my book, I have a chapter about misinterpretations of the Quran. There are a lot of passages that Muslims need to take ownership of and give you interpretations of what they mean today. If it says kill the infidel where you find them, you know, if that's referring to all infidels at all times, that's incompatible with interfaith work. If it refers to one battle in 617 AD that happened and doesn't apply anymore, and they then, the next step of reform is not only the Islamic State, do they reject jihad? If the doctrine of jihad, if their answer to you about a doctrine of jihad is an apologetic that, well, jihad has to be declared by a group of scholars who are respected, or ulama, that will give you a consensus that it's done for just war, and then they'll give you the example of our invasion of Iraq, in which we went in and did preemptive war. You know, listen, the world, that conversation might make sense in 800, 900 AD, where there were no secular democracies. But in today's world, my question we ask our youth is not, you know, there's a concept in Islam called Salafism, which is looking backwards to do what the friends of the Prophet did. The Salafis think that everything I talk about is inventions or bid'ah or new things into Islam that don't exist. And you can't put in new things because you have to go back to the literalist exact narrative that the Prophet did. I then tell them, well, how do you use medical science, computer science, and all these other things that didn't exist then? And their answer is that, you know, well, as long as it doesn't contradict. So the issue is that I tell them political science can evolve too. And that there are other sciences of human interaction. I think if the Prophet was alive today, he would reject the fact that the leader of the military should be also the leader of the state, should also be the leader of the message of God. While he wore all three of those hats, I believe that if Muhammad was alive today, and this is the only way to reconcile it with modernity, is that he would separate those roles. And that our religious leaders who teach us about religious law and the ability to choose or reject that should not be also the ones making the law and using their exegetical ways of determining law versus reason. And that these things can be reformed. And I think that needs to be central to interfaith dialogue. But the skill sets of doing these things need honing. You're not going to be able to do it right away. But the premise of them need to be principles that you agree on. The equality of men and women. I mean, if you look, for example, at the document, there's a document that 130 plus imams in the West and in America signed to reject ISIS, this Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. And so many in the media were waving this letter to Baghdadi, it's called. You can go to the website, lettertobaghdadi.com. They were waving it as being this great moderate document. Oh, look, the American imams have spoken up and condemned the violence. Okay, well, sure, they condemned the barbaric public beheadings that were done. Where were they when Saudi Arabia's been doing this for 50 years? Where were their documents against the government of Pakistan and elsewhere? It's easy to do it, just like President Obama against a stateless group that is brazen and as open in what they do, number one. Number two, the devil's in the details. That 24-page document, look at it. It condemns Baghdadi's caliphate, but endorses the caliphate, which is they compare it to the EU, which is an absurd comparison. But they say the caliphate can only be called upon by legitimate scholars and a union of Islamic states that are democracies and brought about by elections. Wow, I don't want to live in those democracies. because those are democracies that get their inspiration from one faith. And once anything's done with, I mean, my fear of the Middle East is actually now, as the Assad regime continues to pummel its populations. In Iraq, we've seen a huge exodus. 80% of Christians have left Iraq in the past 15 years. There's hardly any, there's only a few 100,000 left. In Syria, similarly, they're leaving. As minorities leave the Middle East, it'll be the death of the Middle East. Not only because of the history, but societies function when there's diversity. When there's homogeneity, they deteriorate because there's no critical thinking. And this is the aspect of interfaith dialogue that can be so paralyzing if it's done incorrectly. If it's done as simply a kumbaya of what we share and all the positive things, that's not going to be of any value. But if you talk about the hard questions and focus it on one topic at a time and critically analyze and critique where you share and where you differ and how you can live in the same city, same town, same country, that's valuable interfaith dialogue. So I think ultimately neither side, the dictators nor the Islamists, were right. I call these guys the mafia of the Middle East, of the Muslim world. It's the heads of all the Islamic countries. And until we're able to say that all of their Islamic states are not Islamic, we're not going to get anywhere. And Muslims need to do that. You can't do that. Muslims need to form coalitions. We formed an American Islamic Leadership Coalition which stands against political Islam, but yet is very diverse, from the far right to the far left of Muslims. We've got feminists, gay rights activists, and also conservative, family value-oriented Muslims like our AIFD that have joined together to say, you know what, we joined together just like America to stand against political Islam. Initially, the Syrian revolution was the same way. But after 4 months of being shot in the streets and 10,000 being killed a month in 2011, the good guys went away or were killed, and you saw radical Islam thrive. And, you know, the analogy I like to use is, where is radical Islam doing the best in America? In prisons. Why is that? Number one, the teachers of the prisons, the imams there are the worst. They're the more militant jihadist type that are teaching them the doctrine of jihad and, you know, sort of a collectivist, militant Islam. But the second is there's no ideas coming into the prison from anywhere else. And Syria is like that now. It has been like that while my family left 40 years ago. These countries are prisons. So if you want to control the prisoners, you give them an idea that radicalizes them so that you can say you always need a warden and you always need a dictator. De Tocqueville, in his book Democracy in America, said that the reason democracy is successful is because America is a religious society. If it wasn't religious, you'd need a military dictatorship. If it was corrupt, you'd need a dictatorship. But because it's religious, you don't need thought police and military police, because they're not going to kill each other when they disagree. So ultimately, Muslims have shown themselves to be great protesters, but very poor Democrats with a small d. And I think Time Magazine got it right. From Boston to every country we go to, our current strategy is a whack-a-mole program. We're going from one area to the next, and we're not treating the disease. And interfaith, I believe, is the place where you can start to do that, is to challenge my community to communities to light a fire under our feet so that we can wake up. And I want to leave you with a quotation. Actually, one thing I want to tell you, and you know, these are some of the things. These are some of the groups that exist out there that claim to speak for Muslims. Muslim Public Affairs Council, CARE. These are all Islamist groups. And how do you define Islamist groups? It's not only what they say, but it's what they don't say. If they're not doing work against the Islamic State concept, like Jefferson and Madison were, then they're not. Then to me, they're Islamists, or at least apologists to the point that they're not doing anything valuable. You know, they might be doing counter-radicalization and working against violence, which is great. That's all wonderful. But I compare it to doing work against drunk driving without dealing with the alcoholism. You can sit till the cows come home and take keys away from people at bars, right? But unless you treat the alcoholism and the family values issues and other things, you're not going to treat the problem and affect the death rate. The question I always get, and I'll just take 1 minute. The question I always get is, out of the Muslims, how many agree with you? Are you some type of mutant? What's the percentage that agree with you? Whether this is the American population, 3 million, or global 1.5 million, I would tell you, look at the continuum along the bottom there. Let's say that continuum of population went from secular thought, which means no Islam in government, all the way to theocratic thought. Most of the statistics show that somewhere in the middle there, you've got 30% or so that believe in a theocratic party, Islamic government, versus the rest that are secular. On both sides, where I have the green and the black colored in, are violent, radical terrorist types. Both sides. There are secular terrorists and there are Islamist terrorists. The war of ideas, if you will, is really along where my arrows are there. Trying to shift Muslims into the secular idea to believe that, not secular as an anti-religious, but that the best form of government is one that rejects theocracy. And in between, this is where the battle is and this is where the numbers are. So if you say in mosques, they talk about 80% of mosques being Islamist. Well, remember, mosques are not the entire Muslim population. Those are the Muslims that really identify and want to establish Islamic groups. So they're going to be much higher in the Islamist movement numbers right now. Now, eventually, I'd like to see that shift, where the Muslims that have rejected the mosque eventually come back to communities and want to form their own mosques. But that hasn't happened. There's a quote from Bassam Tibi, and my last thing I want to tell you is that he was a German Muslim scholar who, by the way, retired in America because he said even though he was a second-generation Muslim in Germany, he never felt German. He said, the secularization of Christianity did not bring about its demise. I would argue that it brought about its liberation to the personal domain. This culture is still very Christian, but it doesn't have to coerce it in law to be so. Because the character of the people is Christian and Jewish and many faiths. That is the culture, the character we see. Religion must simply be protected from state exploitation. So thank you. I hope that we can continue the dialogue. I think these are the, I know there was a lot of stuff there, but ultimately the Muslim world is going through an opportunity. Yes, there's a lot of war and conflict, but this is an opportunity where America needs to take sides. You can do it in Omaha. All politics are local, and we can also do it in Syria and Iraq and globally, but we're not taking sides within the House of Islam, which we need to do. Thank you.